the men were sent to attack the Ammonians. They started from Thebes, having guides with them, and may be clearly traced as far as the city of Oasis. 7 days' journey across the sand. But, thenceforth nothing is to be heard of them. It is certain that they neither reached the Ammonians, nor even came back to Egypt. Further than this, the Ammonians reported that the Persians set forth from Oasis, across the sand, and had reached halfway to Siwa, when, as they were taking their midday meal, a wind arose from the south, strong and deadly, bringing with it vast columns of sand, which entirely covered up the troops and caused them to wholly disappear. Herodotus, Book 3 of the Histories. Join us tonight for Episode 1 of Portal, where we look into the disappearance of 50,000 troops of the Persian king Cambyses II.
Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Amber Ray.
And I'm Andrew McKay, and on tonight's episode, we're looking into the lost army of Cambyses II, the Persian king. Just a few brief comments on the show before we get going here. There's a lot of cool stuff to get into with this story.
Definitely.
Obviously, just the idea alone of 50,000 troops
just vanishing into the sands.
Is
a
wild.
sea of sand, as it's been named.
Yeah, it's absolutely wild. Mm-hmm. But the subsequent expeditions and hoaxes that would follow this story for, thousands of years now since the event.
Up to present day, it still continues.
Totally, and there's a lot to get into, so...
There's a lot of contradiction, a lot of ambiguity, and we're ready to tackle it.
We're ready to tackle it for you guys.
Exactly. There's a few things. There's definitely going to be some mispronunciations. We're going to have fun with that for sure. Probably going to be calling Cambyses for the most part. Might refer to him as Cambyses offhand. Who cares?
Yeah. Sorry, not sorry. Some people do refer to him as Cambyses, and yeah, we've heard both in different documentaries and things like that. But let's get into it. So what are the main elements of this story? I mean, we've got the Persian king. It's described by a Greek. Herodotus is the main. He's the sole source of this narrative. The only person that actually told this story, perpetrated the myth. Right, and he was a Greek historian known as the father of history, and we're going to get into him in more detail as we go along here and sort of his account. So, let's break down a little bit of Cambyses, because before we get into the actual account of the Lost Army, I think it's
important to do some background.
Definitely.
Give some context here.
So, Cambyses, who was this guy?
Who was this guy? He was the son of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire.
Right.
Yes. So, this guy in particular, he was one of two sons of Cyrus. He essentially inherited the crown. How old was he? He was probably in his mid-20s to 30s, I think
say. Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, sort of a young character, described as a hothead, psychologically unsound, according to Herodotus.
Right. Very
interesting anecdotes from that guy that we'll definitely get into.
The madman Cambyses, as he refers to him.
Exactly.
But whether or not that's... Yeah, we'll get into the validity of those claims from Herodotus too, because there are
conflicting accounts from Egyptian sources and otherwise that definitely paint a different picture.
Right, but I mean, his character obviously is really important when it comes to this story and the likelihood of the event actually happening, or whether or not they took the route that they did and things like that, and we're going to break all that down.
Exactly.
So, yeah, he's the son of Cyrus the Great. So the Achaemenid Empire, that formed... When was that formed? Do we have that?
I don't think we have an exact date.
I believe it was 5...
He definitely...
We'll get back to that. We'll come back to that.
Oh, yeah. We got sources for that.
But, sure. Ultimately, I mean, Cyrus was... he was a lot more...
He basically was the founder of this Achaemenid Empire. He was the joiner of the Medians with the Persians,
right.
Kind of a half-breed himself between the two. From what I read, actually, Persians were almost looked down upon during the Median royal family reign, which was immediately prior to Cyrus. Yeah, definitely some interesting stories about him and his sort of rise to power. He was kind of a baby in the basket type story from the Bible, right? Where he was of royal birth, sent away because he was seen as a threat from the king that was ruling at the time.
Right.
Grew up in a very modest upbringing, essentially lived that way until his royal parentage was recognized and he was reunited. He became a warrior of sorts, ended up... he actually revolted against the king that sent him away as a baby. Really? And then ended up, it was a Median, I can't remember the name of the guy, but anyways, he definitely was an interesting character, that's for sure, and basically founded this empire and expanded it. What did he do? He conquered Babylon.
He conquered Babylon, kingdom of Babylon.
Mm-hmm. He essentially set up Cambyses to push further west, right? And just add on to the existing empire.
That's right. And
so that was the reason, right?
So the Achaemenid Empire founded in 550 BC.
Beautiful. There you go. So about 25 years before the myth takes place that we will be discussing.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, Cambyses. After Cyrus, his son Cambyses, named Cambyses II because I believe it was his grandfather was the first Cambyses.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he takes over for his dad, and he starts to push. I mean, he's got some ambitions. He's not a...
As a boy, when he was about 10 years old, he declared that he was going to go to war with Egypt.
As a boy.
As a boy. So it's almost like, he was definitely fulfilling his own prophecy.
Right.
There are some anecdotes that refer to other reasons why he invaded Egypt, for sure.
I mean, they were expanding empire, though. Ultimately, he wanted to gain territory.
Maybe he was just looking for a reason.
Right.
He definitely put the king of Egypt, I think it was King Amasis, in a tight spot, that's for sure. So I guess we can dive into that, or what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cambyses, he moves into Egypt, and he's starting to make advances in there, and he's successful.
Initially, he is successful. He invades, he takes Memphis. This was after King Amasis' death. So, essentially, his son, Psamathes, whatever.
Psamathes.
I don't know, there's a P in there, and then there's an S, so whatever.
Close enough.
Yes. So, essentially, this guy, King Psamathes, he is, he's basically humiliated by Cambyses. After Cambyses takes Memphis, crowns himself, Egyptian pharaoh king, whatever they call themselves in that particular era. But he essentially humiliates this king, and then after seeing how stoic and strong this guy actually was, after basically sending his son to his death, humiliating his daughter and his entire royal court that he once reigned over, Cambyses then turns around, invites this guy into his court to live, and then once he finds out a little while later... Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, and then he finds out that this Psamathes character is planning a bit of a revolt and just ends up
I see.
nixing him.
And he gets offed.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So he's definitely not afraid to get people out of the way that he needs to. That's for sure. And we'll get to more of that as we go along. This story gets pretty dark.
So where the myth actually takes up was after this initial success and the push into the west and the south. So the south would have been towards Ethiopia, and you have that awesome anecdote, Andrew, about the
that's right.
Herodotus and the Ethiopian king and the fish eaters.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. So it sort of began before he sends the 50,000 troops towards the Siwa Oasis to eliminate the Oracle of Zeus. He wants to make advances to Ethiopia, and so basically what he does is he has this very backhanded, underhanded sort of gesture to the Egyptian, rather to the Ethiopian king, and basically what he does is
much wiser.
Clearly. So basically what he does is he sends what Herodotus describes as the fish eaters to Ethiopia, and the reason was these fish eaters, they could speak the Ethiopian dialect. And looking into that a little bit, basically fish eaters as described by Herodotus are any coastal peoples, and in this case they could speak the same dialect, so they were perfect to send to Ethiopia. So he sends these guys down there, and he sends with them these dyed cloth linens.
Yeah, there was a red dyed cloth.
Some
there
gifts.
Was the wine. There was one other thing.
Right, the Persian wine, which he said he liked. That
exactly. That was the one thing that the king complimented on, but backhandedly.
Backhandedly, yeah. So Anyway, so basically this Ethiopian king, I've misplaced his name here, but we'll get back to that. But this Ethiopian king, he calls the bluff. I mean, he knows that knows what's going on with the Persian advance
immediately,
and he knows that this is a very
so the tale goes.
Yeah, I mean, this is just sort of a little precursor to what's to come, and he can read between the lines. So he sends them back, and he calls them out and sends them back, and so, of course they report back to Cambyses, and Cambyses is choked. He's not happy at all.
And there's that little bit about the bow that's given to the messengers.
That's right. So why don't you go over that a little
Definitely,
bit?
yeah. So I uncovered that a little bit. Essentially, what happened was the king, in response, the Ethiopian king, sends back with these guys this bow. It's an Ethiopian bow. It's massive. It's nothing like the Persians ever used. And you need a lot of strength to pull it back and actually draw the bow in order to shoot the arrow, obviously. Right. And so anyways, he basically gives them a challenge, this Ethiopian king, and tells them as soon as one of these Persians can draw the bow, then they'll be ready to come and fight the Ethiopians. Because these Ethiopians, they actually have a really interesting reputation as very long-lived, very strong, and just a very healthy population in general.
Right.
Interesting, right? I think they're rumored to live to be about 120 years on average. While Persians were lived to be on average, I think he said about 80 years.
Dang, that's...
So, quite the difference. And then that was the backhandedness with the wine, right? Where he said, like, basically, oh, this is the pitfall of your society. You have all this wonderful wine, and therefore you drink too much, and you're lazy, and you don't live as long as a result. So anyways, he sends the messengers back with this bow. Cambyses, enraged at being found out his little whatever scheme, and being unable to draw the bow himself, and having none of his other troops be able to draw this bow, this mythical bow, right. except for his brother, Smerdis. Also known as Barida, depending on the source. Darius, the Cambyses' successor, he actually refers to Cambyses' brother as Barida, but in Herodotus' account, he is Smerdis.
Okay, well,
yeah,
the latter's a little easier to pronounce.
Character, what a name, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
So Smerdis, he's the only one that can draw the bow, and he can't even really draw it. He only pulls it a few inches. I think it's about 2 inches that he's managed to draw it out. So anyways, in a rage... fitting of Cambyses, as we will further develop in the podcast, he sends him away in a rage. So no brother in Ethiopia. He's left with Darius, his spearman, who is also his successor after the death of Cambyses. And yeah, essentially he's left in this tight position, right, where he is essentially challenged. He's been humiliated by the Ethiopian king, I would say.
Totally. In
a haste. Sends a faction of his troops, a whole army, south to deal with the Ethiopians. Yep. And then the other half, the 50,000... Well, I'm not even sure if it was actually half, where the numbers aren't quite clear.
That's the part that's not really clear. But basically, he essentially divides up his troops, whether or not it's 50,000
go west, and then the others go south.
Right. The southern expedition is a little easier because the routes are more laid out, and they know where they're going. Whereas
they're more familiar.
They're more familiar with it.
And they do have more resources along the way until they reach the sands of the south.
That's right.
Yeah, I remember reading in Herodotus' account how essentially they are in very short supply because Cambyses sends them out essentially without any forethought. No supplies secured, no water, no nothing. So they're living off the grasses. They're literally grazing as they go.
Like
soldiers.
Cattle.
Soldiers are grazing. How are you supposed to fight when you're just eating grass?
Yeah, once you get there, you'd think you'd be a little low in energy.
Nutrient deficiency.
Yeah.
Anyways, so these guys, they end up eating grass until there's no grass, and they reach the sands, and then they resort to cannibalism.
Eesh.
And it's essentially a huge, massive failure. And
they were taking like 1 in every 10 or something. That's what the account says?
Yes, that is. Yeah, they resort to cannibalism. 1 out of every 10 is basically eaten by his fellow soldiers.
Good times. Hope they brought some barbecue sauce with them.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways,
taste them up.
So that's obviously when things start to go really sour for Cambyses. Things are not going well in that Ethiopia campaign.
Nope.
And he gets wind of this, though, and he calls it off.
He does. He sends them back. Once he realizes that his troops are eating each other, he's like, okay, no.
And that's a point we're going to come back to because it ties into Herodotus' claims that he's a madman. Mm-hmm. But he makes a fairly rational choice after making an irrational one, you could argue, and initially sending them out in haste. Mm-hmm. But he realizes that it's not going to work, and he calls it off, right?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, he sends the other faction of his troops to destroy this Oracle of Zeus. Now, the Oracle of Zeus was located at the Siwa Oasis. Now, the Siwa Oasis is it's west of the Nile, right? West of Thebes. Is that correct?
It is. It's northwest.
It's northwest of Thebes. It's out into the desert. It is not along the Nile.
And normally, an important point is that normally if you're traveling to the Siwa Oasis, you don't take the desert route. You take the coastal route. Yeah. And there's only one road. Literally up until the 1980s. This is like last century. There was no road. It was a caravan track. And then in the 1980s, they ended up developing a road. So there's one road that goes into Siwa.
Wow.
It's the only way in or out.
Crazy.
Very, yeah.
That's wild.
Very remote. So anyway, so they're taking an unconventional route.
According to Herodotus.
According to Herodotus, yes. So their next stop was Karga, the Karga Oasis, which is about, I think he says is about a 7-day journey, 7-day march.
Yeah, 7-day march across the sand. And, you know, the other part of the story was that they were also sent in haste, like without adequate provisions, but that they were going to have an agreement.
They did have a pact with the Arabian king.
Right.
Where apparently Arabians take their pacts incredibly seriously, and so he had basically made an agreement with this king that they were going to have water pots essentially along the way stationed.
Right.
So food supplies ready. So they didn't have to have these caravans, right? Which was the more practical way of traveling, not with 50,000 people because you need all the supplies to go with it.
A lot of people.
It's a lot of people. I mean, even if it is 5,000 or 15,000, you know what I mean? Like, that's a lot of supplies.
15,000 people, you've got all the animals traveling with them, you've got to feed and water the animals.
So if you do have that secured, then that's a huge thing out of your way,
That's
right?
a lot, definitely.
So with that in mind, he sends them west. And all right, so now that we're sending them west,
and this is where Herodotus' account, you know, he
gets a little vague.
It gets a little vague, but they made it as far as this first oasis. It was totally probable that they could make it there. Still quite a trek, 7 days journey across the sand, and even if they were set up by the Arabian king and were picking up water and supplies along the way, that's still a long way to go, but they reportedly made it that far. Now, obviously, the story continues from there, basically saying that
they never reached the Ammonians that they were sent to attack at the Siwa Oasis. The Oracle of Zeus, the Oracle of Amon. We've seen both of those, right? Yeah. Not sure if they're two different people.
We should probably break down a little bit of what that means too. I mean, when you're reading about ancient oracles, it always sounds like it's like
just very mystical, very
right. But in fact, they were real human beings.
Exactly.
That just were labeled. They were
essentially tools of priests.
Right. Basically, they were the human crystal ball of the high level priests,
and they were a propaganda tool.
Totally. Absolutely. They were. They'd be coerced into saying or not saying whatever the powers that be wanted them to. And that's essentially what that means.
And so another reason, did we already cover this, where they were sent there to destroy the oracle because of the prophecy, according to Herodotus?
According to Herodotus, there was this prophecy from the Oracle of Zeus that Cambyses would meet an early demise. It was a little bit vague.
And it had a particular location, too. It had a city.
That's right.
And originally, Cambyses took this to mean that he would die in his capital, because apparently the name of the town that was named by the oracle was the same name as a Persian city, which was a capital.
That's right.
But there's multiple. Anyways,
yeah. And we'll get into that. in a little.
Exactly.
So anyway, they're at this second oasis. They've presumably topped up their water. They've had a chance to rest. I mean, you're traveling across the Sahara for 7 days. It's not exactly a stroll down Hollywood Boulevard. So they leave this first oasis. Now this
continue
is where
their trek.
Continue their trek. Now this is the part where Herodotus's account, he doesn't specify whether there were Ammonian scouts possibly that had left Siwa and witnessed the Persian troops that had sort of started to move towards them or whatever it may be, but that must have been the case. There had to have been some local Bedouin travelers that witnessed this, or Ammonian scouts or something, because basically as the story goes, they leave the second oasis, they're on their way to Siwa, they're about halfway, And then during their midday meal, they're taking a break, crazy wind picks up, and they're buried in the sand. Lots of modern accounts speculate whether that's even possible or not. And we're going to get into that as well, because it's totally fascinating. The likelihood of a giant desert sandstorm actually engulfing, 100 people, let alone 50,000 people, whether it's possible. But we're going to get into that because it's really interesting.
There's definitely a lot of theories about that.
So we should probably get into the background on Herodotus a little bit here.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So,
he's a character.
Because, obviously he's the basis of this entire story.
If he hadn't included those, it's like less than a paragraph, hey? Like, yeah. And that's the other thing, right? Like, his credibility often comes into question because, as you've said, right, he is a man of history. He's also, father of history, father of lies,
right,
that type of thing.
That's sort of how he's known as.
Debated.
Totally. So let's, I'll break down Herodotus and then we'll get into that.
Cool.
So basically, it's important to mention right off the bat, he was not the first Greek in Egypt, writing about Egypt. So there was Hectaeus of Miletus. That is as good as I can do, people. Feel free to send us Facebook messages or emails on. Yeah, thank you. You can correct our pronunciation anytime you want. Send us in whatever you want. Anyways, so yeah, Hectaeus of Miletus, he was the first one there. He was there in 500 BC, so some 70-ish years before Herodotus.
But he often focused on different things, right?
Yeah, he had more of a... Yeah, his writing style was slightly different than Herodotus, even though both of them were obviously working in sort of an oral tradition, because he was the father of history.
Transcribing oral into written. Mm-hmm.
Totally. Everything was passed down orally, so, people criticize him for that, for writing in sort of a story format. But when you're having these things relayed to you that way, that's how the thought process worked.
Exactly.
And I don't think that takes away necessarily from the credibility, even though sometimes the stories that he wrote were some of the things he wrote were pretty outlandish, and we'll give some examples in a second here. But just to put things in perspective too, like Hectaeus of Miletus was there in 500 BC. Okay, so 70 years before Herodotus. Just for perspective, the Great Pyramid of Giza is dated around around 2560 BC. So over 2,000 years before Herodotus. That's wild.
That's a lot of history.
That is wild.
It's a lot of stuff
And 500 years before, and then he's 500 years before Christ. It's wild.
Right.
Anyway, we're dealing with a lot of, it's insane.
It's just hard. Like sometimes, just the scale of it all, hey? And just the scope, and you're just like, whoa.
It's overwhelming a little bit.
It's a lot.
But it's fun.
It's fascinating.
So anyway, Herodotus, like you said, father of history, father of lies.
Mm-hmm.
He's known as both.
Definitely got some interesting accounts of the wildlife. Hey, there was that one story.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
You got that?
I'm gonna give that example in just a sec.
Okay.
But but yeah, Herodotus. We don't really know too much about him other than what is written in the histories.
He wasn't of a nobility, was he?
He had to have been. There's no direct.
The learning, the writing.
Right. There's no direct reference to him coming from like a super wealthy family or anything like that. But we do know that he was born in a place called Halicarnassus, which was a corner of Asia Minor. So I believe that's modern day Turkey. But yeah, the idea was that he was definitely upper class. He had the means to travel
and to pursue this as a career.
That's totally. And he claims to have traveled as far as downstream as the first cataract of the Nile. So this is, in East Africa, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
And then as far north as the Black Sea. So. But, people doubt the extent of this and whether or not he just...
That could be an exaggeration.
Traveled part of it and then filled in the rest with accounts from other people or whatever. But anyway, the focus of his work was based around the rise of Persia. So, he was right in it. He was the guy to go to for information on the rise of Persia.
The authority on the subject.
Its gains. And he saw the Persian Wars as a conflict between freedom and slavery. And that sort of idea there is definitely an example of the Greek lens. He was writing from a Greek democratic bias. He was hypercritical of Persians and of other peoples, basically. And that's totally understandable. Like, that doesn't take away from anything, I don't think.
Yeah, you can take the man out of Greece, but you can't take the Greece out of the man.
The Greece.
The Greece. Yeah.
But there's a great quote here from the Histories on what he really wanted to accomplish. So it's basically like, how does it go here? What he really wanted to accomplish was take all his fascinations and attempt to unite human and natural phenomena, and in doing so to discover, and in doing so he would attempt to discover the causal connection between widely disparate events.
Cool.
Which I think is really cool, and that's also kind of like what we're trying to do.
Definitely.
Taking, things that are seemingly unrelated on this show and tying it together, trying to make sense of things.
Yeah.
But yeah, super controversial guy, Herodotus. The British Egyptologist Alan Lloyd described him as, he's the father of lies, basically, is how he describes him. But at the same time, he also says, quote, Herodotus is our only consecutive account of Egyptian history between 664 and 525 BC. So, and for all its faults, it provides a bedrock on which all modern work of the period is based. Exactly. That's pretty profound.
That is.
So, I mean, that's an Egyptologist. It obviously is not just storytelling. And there's some truth. There's some truth hiding in here. So, yeah, controversial dude, though. He, in this, with ancient historians and modern historians. So it's not just the modern guys looking back on the histories and saying, this is written with a bias, this is not true, or whatever it may be. Because there were people back in the day. Thucydides was another historian who came after Herodotus.
I always think of him when we talk about Herodotus. I feel like they have very similar leanings as far as their realist perspective, in a sense. They don't really refer back to the gods as much.
No, very much a real, it's very humanist.
Humanist realism. Mm-hmm.
Totally. And the difference between that sort of I found interesting reading about Herodotus in comparison to Thucydides was that Thucydides wasn't really critiqued as much. His account was seen more as, and I guess it's because maybe it was more of a military history specifically, so there was less outlandish storytelling, but basically he wasn't criticized compared to Herodotus, who was. So one of my favorite things that he was called, this word logopios. Such a cool word, and it's Greek. It means fablemonger. So, I mean, there's much worse things to be called than logopios.
Man,
I mean,
he's just trying to work with the material that's given to him.
We are fablemongers in a way. So yeah. But anyway, so yeah, he was a controversial guy, and then even later on after his death, a lot of his records that ended up in Persian archives. People would go back. So there was this king later on named Artaxerxes II, who was a Persian king. And his record keeper would just go in and change Herodotus' accounts to change them to favor.
And is that the permanent record now? Is that all we have? Or?
No, that's not all we have, because the Histories was its own separate thing.
Okay.
But a lot of the other accounts, they would go in and doctor them because they were not very
And there's
favorable.
also that one, the idea that Darius influenced, Cambyses' successor Darius, the Persian king. There's definitely some people out there that theorize that basically Herodotus was just spoon-fed the story about this army getting swallowed up in order to sort of cover up for Cambyses' failings. Yeah. So there's that angle too. Yeah. So you never know. But
anyways, I got this example here.
Yes, can we please talk about the hippo?
So it's pretty hilarious. So just to give a frame of reference for some of the outlandish things that Herodotus was getting into, he spends a lot of time in the Histories, especially in book 3 when he's in Egypt, on the animals of Egypt and animal husbandry and, the process of burying animals and what they look like and where they're located and all this stuff. So one of the funniest ones is his account of the hippopotamus. So I'm going to read a quote here.
My favorite animal.
Read a quote here from book 2 of the Histories. So, the hippopotamus is sacred in the district of Paprimus, but not elsewhere. This animal has 4 legs. All right. So far, so good. Hippos have 4
accurate.
legs. All right. Mm-hmm. This animal has 4 legs, cloven hooves like an ox, a snub nose, a horse's mane and tail, conspicuous tusks, a voice like a horse's neigh, and it's about the size of a very large ox.
I thought there was something to do with stripes in there
So,
too, or no?
There's other translations of the histories that kind of have some other additional
What's with the hooves?
weird... That's a weird description of a hippopotamus. That makes you wonder
I wonder if you ever saw an elephant. Do you think you ever saw an elephant?
I don't know. But I mean...
I feel like hippos and elephants have really similar feet.
They're both massive, obviously, and that's sort of the biggest discrepancy here because, just as a frame of reference, hippos, a male hippo that would have lived in the Nile at that time, the lower Nile, can weigh up to 9,000 pounds. The heaviest ox ever reported modern times is 3,000 pounds. That's a 6,000 pound difference. Yeah. So whether or not this guy actually saw a hippopotamus is definitely up for debate. Mm-hmm. But people will take things like that from the histories and say, yeah, I don't know if this guy was actually there. Mm-hmm. And when you read something like that, that's fair. But then there's a bunch of other things that he did get right. Yeah. The location of temples, the birth process in region to region, the, different religious rite ceremonies and things like that, because he was learning from low-level priests. And so...
Right. So they didn't know it all themselves.
Right, exactly.
They're just passing along best they can.
But that's just an example of some of the craziness, and he references some other things too. To all of you listening out there, get the histories and read it or browse through it. It's fascinating.
It's a good read. It's not hard.
No.
Because we both read...
Thucydides.
Yes, we read Thucydides in school, and it was difficult.
It was painful.
We were reading the side notes mostly. We weren't even reading the actual text just so we actually knew. But this is incredible. The edition we have is... What is it? It's by Penguin Classics?
Yeah, Penguin Classics.
Yeah, and it is fascinating. It's just this awesome narrative. It just goes on and on. So much history.
I mean, he's referencing things like giant ants that dig gold. He makes references to men with the heads of dogs and things like that. And those are definitely examples of working within an oral tradition and kind of adding a little pizzazz to some of his prose, I guess, or whatever you want to call it.
So with all this questioning of his credibility, in relation to the actual myth that we're discussing on the program today, right. I feel like he didn't really exaggerate it that much. I feel like it's almost like this weird afterthought of a passage that's kind of just thrown in there. Mm-hmm. It's sandwiched right in between the tale of the Ethiopian king and the Apis bull incident, which is another one that we definitely want to talk about in relation to Cambyses' psychological instability. Right. Not to maybe we should just go into that.
Yeah, okay. Let's get into the mad Cambyses aspect first, and then go back to the story, because I think that definitely ties into it.
Definitely, just to paint a better picture of who this guy was.
Definitely,
and the way that he went about things as king. Some of it is highly questionable.
I mean, Herodotus makes numerous references to him not being of sound mind.
Exactly,
and I think you have a few of them there.
He says, "Yeah, if he hadn't lost his mind already, then this is another example just to further prove that point." Yeah. But anyways, he does have a few interesting examples. One that I pulled out was the fact that Cambyses... This is not something that is conventional for either Egyptians or Persians at that time, or even after that or before, I don't think. But essentially, Cambyses one day decided that he was in love with his sister. So, anyways, he went to his advisors, his own priests, whatever, just to ask them, is there any law that prevents me from marrying my sister? And these guys, knowing what kind of dude this Cambyses was, he definitely would, oh my gosh, he would, he probably would have just murdered them if if they didn't tell, exactly, if they didn't tell him what he wanted to hear. Yeah. So essentially they were very vague, but they said, we can't think of any law that would not permit this, but we do know a law that basically whatever the king wants, the king gets. Yeah. That's what they tell him. Yeah, the emperor. So he goes and marries her. He ends up marrying two of his sisters, actually. Kills them both out of just spite, mostly.
Just casual.
Just whatever. He took them with him to the Egyptian campaigns and all that. Right. So they were with him at the time, and he also took his brother. So he was the eldest of two brothers. So his little brother's name was Smerdis. We've already covered that. Also known as Berida. He was a guy that definitely, he was on the Egyptian campaign as well. There's the drawing the bow incident, sent away. essentially, there was another prophecy, right, where Cambyses, or was it a dream? I think it was a dream he had where he basically saw his brother sitting on his throne.
That's
in
what
Persia,
it was, a story of
with
a
his
dream.
head touching the sky.
Yeah.
Is how it's described. And so, thinking that essentially his brother is going to usurp his throne from him, he sends his most trusted, his name's Persaxpis, his most trusted friend on the campaign after him to essentially assassinate him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the kind of guy we're working with here. I guess a lot of people were murdering their brothers back in the day, though, right?
It was kind of the
It was
thing
just
to
a power
do.
struggle.
Definitely.
Maybe.
I mean, no
Who knows?
big deal, right?
Yeah, so, but with his two sisters, which is just, it's such a funny dynamic, right? Could you imagine? Imagine being Smerdis, where here's your brother, he's this, like, crazy dude that basically does whatever he wants without any thought as to the consequence. And then you have your two sisters that you both grew up with married to him?
Yeah, I mean, the way
that'd be a very weird dynamic, I feel like.
The way we can picture it now.
I guess, I guess modern day, that would be
I wonder what
weird.
What the whole family dynamic would be in
Yeah.
an ancient royal family. It'd be wild.
Yeah. So essentially, after this whole Smerdis thing happens, there's this account that Herodotus, it's in, book 3, I believe, where he tells of this one, I don't know, there's this one day where Cambyses takes a baby, like a puppy, and he takes a baby lion, like a lion cub, and he pits them together in a fight to the death, out of entertainment. And he's sitting there with his sister/wife, and his sister starts crying because the puppy is suffering. And actually, okay, but even before she starts crying, the puppy, I guess he had a couple of siblings, and the siblings start, like, diving into the fight because the puppy's getting the worst of it out of, puppy, lion cub, who's gonna win? Probably the lion cub. But anyway, so the brothers jump in of this puppy, and they start to, like, and it gets a little more intense, and the girl starts crying, his sister. And so Cambyses asks her, like, why are you crying? And she says, basically, so this is after Smerdis was sent away, and she says, I cry because you are, like, as my lord, you would have no brother to come to your aid. And so it's kind of like this, like, little jab, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so he's like, nope, sorry, you're out here. Executed.
Yeah.
Done. So there you go. There's a little bit of an anecdote there. Let's see. What else do we have as far as his psychological... Oh, the Persaxpis account. That's another one, hey? So the same guy that was sent to assassinate Smerdis, he... This is back in Persia, mind you. This is before the Egyptian campaigns.
Okay.
And one day, Cambyses and him are in the court, and Cambyses casually asks him about the perception of himself with the Persian people, and whether he's revered, whether he's liked, whether he's feared, whatever. Okay. And trying to appease the king, I can't remember what Persaxpis says exactly, but he basically says that they adore you, whatever. And I don't even know. Cambyses, I feel like he was just looking for a way to kind of I feel like he was just a spiteful kind of guy that just wanted to just get under people's skin.
Well, that's definitely the way that...
mess around with people.
Definitely the way that Herodotus sets it up.
Just out of nowhere.
Yeah.
He tells Persaxpis, he says, I'm going to shoot your son with this arrow. If it pierces his heart, that means you're right. But if it doesn't pierce his heart, that means you were lying to me. And so he does. He just literally takes his arrow, boom, shoots the guy right in the heart, kills him, the son of Persaxpis,
sort of
his most trusted friend. And then they immediately rips into his, his chest. They pull out the arrow. It had pierced right through the heart. So he's satisfied.
Right.
And so anyways, and then he says, oh, look at that. And then basically Persaxpis has no other option but to say, exactly, right? Except to say, well, you are God, or not God, you're a king.
Well, they were gods. I mean, they definitely
kings,
were the connection to the gods anyway.
Definitely. And your word is the word, and that's the way it is.
Now, I mean, of course, the element to all this is, like we said before, Herodotus was, the Greeks and Persians weren't exactly buds throughout the centuries.
No.
And obviously there was the Greek and Persian Wars that I think would follow this and precede it as well. But he had a very Greek bias. So he's not gonna
essentially
write
at the time of
favorably.
Herodotus' writings, Egypt was under Persian control under Darius.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Because there was a few years of revolt after Cambyses' death.
Okay.
And then essentially what happens is Darius wrangles up the empire
It kind of gets
because all the peripheries, once, you know, like, this sort of, like, instability occurs, there's this account of a false king that comes after Cambyses, which we should definitely dive into as well.
Oh, for sure.
And then Darius essentially seizes the throne. Basically, he's the one that came up with the term Achaemenid, right? Because before that, it was... Cyrus never even aligned himself with... what's his name? Achaemenes, I believe? Achaemenes.
And these names are so cool.
I know, right? He was basically an ancient Persian that they're just basically, like, hearkening back to as some sort of, line of ancestry that's, like, royal.
For sure.
So,
that makes sense.
Anyway, so Darius, he himself has no royal blood. He is nobility, but he's not. So anyways, that was just his attempt, or it is interpreted by a lot of academics and researchers today as just his attempt to consolidate his legitimacy and his authority.
Right. That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get back to the story itself.
Mm-hmm.
So the...
Because there's definitely some inconsistencies with the idea that the 50,000 men were sent to destroy the Oracle. There's also the idea that that the West was simply just a strategic stronghold for trade,
right?
That type of thing. There was the land, it's so funny, the lands of Kush that were gold mines, like they were mining gold, literally. Right. And so that was incredibly important, along with other resources, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, he had a reason to go there besides just to destroy an oracle.
Exactly.
For sure. But I think the fact that Herodotus is a Greek, writing from a Greek lens, is important because this whole madman Cambyses thing, you know, there's other later accounts, Egyptian accounts, that we came across, where the Egyptians kind of, you know, they didn't really hate Cambyses necessarily. No. Like, there's lots of accounts where he was almost seen as an Egyptian. And yes. he wasn't. And
he didn't disrupt all their
right.
Rituals, their practices, that type of thing. Like, right. Herodotus seems to, like, convey in his account.
Yeah.
Because that's where we come back to the Apis bull incident.
Right.
Where essentially this comes right on the cusp of the vanishing army in the book. And essentially what happens is there's this bull that's born. And it's just this special calf. And it is what the Egyptians take to be a manifestation of the god Apis. So that's why it's called the Apis bull.
Right.
Anyways, and it's a special bull. Essentially, the cow that gives birth to this calf is never able to have another calf again, is how it's described. And it's always a black calf with a bit of a white on its head. And it's, I don't know, it's just, yeah, so it has a very distinct look about it. And essentially what happens is after this the army goes missing. Cambyses is still in Memphis. The Egyptians start to celebrate. They're having all these, they're in the streets, they're having festivities, and he's like, what the heck is going on here? Why didn't you guys do this the first time when I defeated and rode into Memphis? Like, why is this going on right now? And so the priests then convey to Cambyses that essentially this Apis bull has just been born. And Cambyses laughs at this in Herodotus' account. He says, oh, your gods are made of blood and flesh. They can feel the pierce of my steel sword or whatever. And then that's when he ends up stabbing this Apis bull. And he slips. He means to stab him right through the heart, like right in the middle. But he ends up only, like, nicking his calf or something. Or his thigh.
Bad aim.
Which is, it is a fatal injury. The calf ends up dying, like, 7 days later? 10 days later? I don't know. Something like that. So, and at the same time, I feel like, I don't even know if this Apis bull is just more of a fable of Cambyses. Because it isn't conveyed in other Egyptian texts. And it just seems like a clean ending for him in relation to Cambyses' death, because he ends up dying in Herodotus' account by his own sword, right? He ends up, he's jumping on his horse trying to get back to Persia to deal with this supposed coup or whatever. And he jumps on the horse and the shaft of his, his protective thing for his sword breaks and it pierces his thigh. He ends up getting gangrene, dying 2 weeks later, that type of thing. Makes that deathbed confession that he killed Smerdis. Or no, he didn't kill Smerdis, but he sent Chrysaxus to assassinate him. It's kind of his confession. And then that's where we kind of get into that bit of a murky area with the whole brother and...
Yeah, the Darius coming in. But it's...
Exactly.
And there's obviously different accounts of whether or not he killed himself or if he died of gangrene. Obviously, in Herodotus' account, that's what it is.
In the Byzantine inscription, that's the official record that Darius inscribes as king of Persia. He's very, very vague, and all he says is that Cambyses died his own death, is how it's translated a lot of the time. And it's been misinterpreted for sure as a suicide, when in reality it's probably more likely it was an accident. I feel like Cambyses, from what we read, I feel like he's not really a suicidal type.
Probably
I feel like he's more like a megalomaniacal type of whatever. Like,
possibly.
Like he's...
Well, so let's backtrack a little bit here, because
we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to the actual event itself. So the likelihood of this campaign even beginning in the first place. I feel like the way that Herodotus accounts for it, sending out this 50,000 troops in haste, destroy the Oracle, not thinking ahead too much other than the one point we made about possibly having a agreement with the Arabian king. Mm-hmm. But, he describes Herodotus as this irrational guy, this madman, mm-hmm. yet he pulled his troops back from Ethiopia. He pulled them back. He made that, he said...
Yeah, you didn't say just keep going until you get there, then you'll get fed.
Yeah, exactly. He had...
That just shows he has a little bit of rationality.
Exactly. He was of sound enough mind.
I wouldn't say he has a heart, but I would say, he's maybe more so just as far as preserving his own image as king, right?
Sure, yeah. Regardless of what it is. I mean, he had the wherewithal enough to at least be like, eating each other is probably not the best thing for me. Mm-hmm. Let's pull back and regroup.
Yeah. He never makes another excursion, though.
To suggest that he would make that decision on the one hand, but then on the other hand say, screw it. Let's send 50,000 troops into the desert mm-hmm. and hope for the best, and they never come back. It just seems like that would be a strange decision to make after having a rational choice of pulling your troops back from Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. But that being said, he did have ambitions in the West, and, maybe it's just the number 50,000 is misreported or whatever, and mm-hmm. we've come across accounts where, modern-day historians basically say, cut a zero
or two
or more, or whatever it may be, to make it a more reasonable number. But 15,000 troops, 5,000 troops, 500 troops, that's still insane.
That's putting up real numbers there.
Mm-hmm. So... Let's get into the some of the accounts. You want to get into some of the accounts?
Yeah, are we diving into the theories, or?
I mean, let's get into the theories because they definitely tie into some of the critiques of Herodotus as we go here.
So, the way that I kind of structured this when I was going through the contemporary accounts, basically there's two lines of thought regarding the fate of the army, as far as there's the first line of thought, which was basically, yes, this army was swallowed up by a sea of sand. There's a second line of thought we can discuss after that, but most of the theories that we've come across do revolve around trying to find a bunch of bones in the desert.
Yeah, that they did get sent out, that they were between the first Oasis and the Siwa Oasis.
So essentially between Karga and Siwa.
Right. Mm-hmm. That somewhere in that section of desert there is a cache of bones and swords to be found.
And all the armor, all the supplies, everything.
Right. And so that's what people have been...
It would be one of the most important archaeological discoveries of multiple centuries, essentially, is how it's been described.
Absolutely. It would be wild if that was legitimately found and the Egyptian Department of Antiquities or whatever would actually be like, do an evaluation.
Supreme Council of Antiquities.
The Supreme Council, who are let's just say they're difficult to deal with.
They're very opaque. They don't release a lot of information. No. I was looking on their website, and it kind of reminds me of just the Egyptian government in general.
Well,
right?
It's an arm of the Egyptian government.
Well, that's exactly Anyways, we could
talk
about that a different day. But anyways,
all right. So let's get into
the first line of thought.
The first line of thought. Go for it.
So, first modern day account that we were able to find in relation to the search comes from the 1800s.
Yeah.
This guy, Barzoni.
I believe he was
I think he was.
He wasn't outright looking for the army.
Well, no, he was just an Egyptologist.
Okay.
He definitely raided and took away some very prized discoveries that probably should have just remained in situ. But yeah,
that was typical of the 1800s.
That was before the Supreme Council of Antiquities was formed. I believe that was in the 1830s or 40s, and just so they could rein in, because there was a lot of looting, a lot of raiding of these sacred sites and whatever.
Which is such a shame.
It really is.
To think of what could have been found
and what's on the black market now these days, I wonder, hey?
Yeah.
But anyway, so there was this guy, Belzoni, and fruitless attempt, never found anything, no remains, no nothing.
Okay.
So the next attempt came in the 1930s. Laszlo Almazi, or Almazi, I've heard both.
Yeah, Almazi.
I feel like Almazi is better.
Now, this guy's fascinating, and I did not make the connection. I mean, I did after reading a little bit, but I had never read The English Patient or seen the movie The English Patient. I didn't even
know it was a book. I thought it was just a movie.
Which is with Ralph Fiennes. So,
watch it.
It's kind of funny. It's one of those things. It's like with this story, we start researching it, and then we realize how mainstream some of this stuff is. But we'd never heard of it before. There's a lot of connections. So, but this Laszlo Almazi guy, he was 1930s, correct?
Yeah, he was a Hungarian fellow. He made numerous trips to Africa. I think he made 3 excursions in particular to the Libyan desert. He's actually been credited with coming up with the modern way to actually traverse sand dunes in a vehicle.
Right, he let the air out of the tires.
Exactly,
and so
the Model
it could get better grip.
He would, we've seen images of this and video clips of him basically going up over the top and down over the other side.
It looks like fun.
It's actually, that would take a lot of talent, a lot of patience for all the times he gets stuck, hey?
True,
anyways,
true.
He pioneered the method where essentially... you go straight up and then straight down the dune, and then you have to speed up at the very bottom in order to stop yourself from getting stuck in that little...
Right at the bottom
of the hill. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. So anyways, a very interesting fellow.
And he wasn't looking for the Lost Army either, though. He was looking for the lost city of Zerzura, though, correct?
Well, that's kind of a little bit... Yeah, he was looking for both.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And he had a...
And Zerzura, just so everyone out there listening knows, is a ancient mythological city, the White City.
The White City of Zerzura.
Lost in the Sahara, and that is going to be a future episode, so Stay tuned for that.
Definitely. So he was looking for that. He was looking for the Lost Army. He made inroads into the approximate location that he thought the army would be, and he did report that to a colleague, but basically took that to the grave. He didn't go into any more details, and... Yeah, the guy was actually interviewed.
Doesn't that just seem to happen a lot, though? With all these stories where someone just takes it to the grave. Wouldn't you want to just write it on a sticky note or something right before you die?
Maybe it was and just got lost or something.
Possibly.
But anyways, so he never actually found anything. I feel like
the pots. He found the pottery, right? Or was that a misattributed find?
I honestly feel like that might have been a misattributed find from the documentary, right? That one about Bowen and that Gail McKinnon, the geologist and the anthropologist. It's such a hokey documentary.
Totally.
But it is interesting, does give some insight into modern attempts from the last 20 years, because they went out there in 2002, I think it was, 2003. But, yeah. Yeah,
I mean, I did come across multiple resources that did attribute the pottery at the base of a hill. Basically, there was all those water jugs, and they did attribute, a few sources that I found did attribute that to Almazi. And basically that it was possibly, I mean, this is very similar to the Castiglione found pots too, and some other things too that we'll get into in a sec, but the agreement that Cambyses had with the Arabian king matches up with this find, and that there's water pots along the route that they would have been taking to get to Siwa, and they're at the base of a hill, so that makes sense. If they were resting for the night or whatever it may be, that's obviously the only place where you can find shelter in the desert, is at this base of a hill, to protect yourself from the wind.
That's actually interesting, because there are later researchers that claim there was this rock, this big old rock that was found by the Castiglione brothers in the 90s.
All right, we'll get to Castiglione in a sec.
Yeah, so it's even debated whether, like, I don't even know if Laszlo Almazi, because, like, his main sort of modus operandi for being in the Libyan desert was to find the city. I feel like the army was sort of a side note, and I feel like it might have even his approximate location of the army. I feel like that might have actually been talking about the White City, because he found apparently this valley that was written in ancient accounts, and it was very accurate. Like, the way he found it was very similar to these accounts. Right. Anyway, so maybe that's what he was talking about. Maybe he never even. Anyways,
could have been. I mean, we'll touch on that in a later episode
sort of
on
point
00.
of ambiguity that just adds to the whole schmoz. But
definitely. So after Almaty, though, in the 1930s, later in the 1930s, there's another guy by the name of Wingate, right?
Yeah, Ord Wingate, British officer. He served in Ethiopia and Sudan, and yeah, he did lead an expedition in 1933 with no findings. Nothing.
I mean, and this is what comes up over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And this is why, again, the reason why I was blown away that I'd never heard of this story, because people have been searching for these bones for this lost army for centuries.
Yeah.
And yeah, a lot of it's fruitless. I mean, obviously it's going to be pretty tough to, I mean, any excavation in the Sahara is going to be
But that's just
tough.
It, right? Because it's a constantly changing landscape with no markers. There's no mountains around. Everything just is constantly shifting.
Yeah. The mountains of sand.
Exactly. The mountains of sand. I heard accounts where basically they can shift from 30 to 50 feet in a year, depending on the way the winds blow, that type of thing.
Wild, eh?
So it's constantly just uncovering stuff and covering others up. So you don't know.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah.
Okay, so he was kind of that was just an example of someone looking for it.
Exactly.
Later, again, still 1930s, we've got Gary Chaffetz. Is that right?
No.
Or is that later on?
No. Chaffetz.
He
came around in the 1980s.
Oh, okay.
He started doing recon missions in 1982. He made approximately 3 trips into his search area, which was approximately, I believe it was 70 miles south of the Siwa Oasis. So this was a 6-month expedition that this guy headed. He's an author, a journalist. He led this expedition in partnership with Harvard University and National Geographic Society.
So this is a legit expedition.
It is definitely legit. They had a budget of $250,000.
For back then, I mean,
$250,000 in 1982 is not peanuts. No. Yeah, exactly. And they had a good team. They had a strong team of talent, included over 20 Egyptian archaeologists. They had what's it called, like a light aircraft and ground penetrating radar,
right?
Which I'm assuming is the 1980s version of today's LiDAR that we've seen used, that we read about in the Monkey God book.
Yeah, to find the lost city, the white city. That's another white city.
I know, right? Yeah, that's what. Yeah, when I came across it, I was like, huh, all these white cities popping up everywhere. Like, what's up with that? Anyways, popping up. Or never popping up.
Yeah,
never. We can't find them.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah, they're just popping up everywhere.
Popping up. So this guy, the only thing he ever found was basically like an ancient caravan trail with these like cairns, is how he described it. And some of these cairns had human remains in them.
What is a cairn? That's basically just a big pot.
Yeah. And there was like these, what he described as burial mounds too. And there was fragments of bone in those. So essentially they dated those. It's not the right time frame, sorry. It was 1500 approximately years ago. So it would need to be another 1,000 years. So not the right time frame. Okay. Still interesting though.
And still possibly could have been a route. It still could have been along the same route that they were taking. Yeah. And that's a whole part of this controversy, is whether or not they were on that path or not.
Exactly.
And we'll get to that in a sec.
Exactly. So essentially what happened, to wrap up this Chaffetz guy, he did this 6-month expedition, not finding much. He did find some things, but definitely not 50,000 people buried in the sand.
Right.
And he was actually banned from returning to Egypt by the Egyptian government because...
Classic.
Yeah, well, I don't really blame them for this. It's just diplomacy, that type of thing. Essentially what he did is he violated Libyan airspace repeatedly, landing in Libya, doing his recon missions, doing this radar. It's ground penetrating radar, so he's in a plane, and anyways, how would you know? Like, you're like, there's nothing around. Like, there's no line in the sand saying this is Libya and that's Egypt, like, you know? But anyways,
we know nothing about air travel and
airspace. And so
really,
he was in some serious doo-doo for a little bit. Like, he was interrogated for, I think, 24 hours by the Egyptian authorities.
Eesh, that'd be scary.
Essentially, he was let go in return for surrendering his aircraft. And it's sitting in an Egyptian museum to this day.
Really?
With a sign that says confiscated from an Israeli spy.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
wow.
Israeli, that was what... Anyways, yeah, so it's just...
That's crazy.
Weird, right? So this is back... That would have been like 30, 40 years ago.
Wild stuff.
That's actually crazy. 40 years ago. 80s. No. Am I saying that right? No, that's like 30 years.
A long time ago.
It's still sitting
We are
there.
not mathematicians. Okay.
No.
So that was 1980s, and...
So the Chevettes, he was never satisfied. He actually did write a book, though.
Did he?
Yes.
We
he
didn't
wrote a
pick
book.
that one up.
No, we never picked it up. I do have it somewhere in my research notes. Essentially, it's a novelization of his account, and definitely an interesting read. Yeah. I would want to read that. Haven't had a chance to yet, but definitely want to get around to it.
So far, just to recap, so far the modern accounts of the search, or just people excavating in the Sahara that have found things that might be linked to it.
That have taken not Cambyses. They've taken Herodotus' account to heart.
Right. Yeah. And so far, obviously the Chefet's artifacts didn't date properly, but the fact that there was a caravan route there, I think, lends to the legitimacy of Herodotus' account, potentially. That there were these routes there, and it wasn't just like this, head off into the desert, there's no path, just make your own path, head over to that massive sand hill and just keep heading northwest. They had maybe a little bit more to go off of, even though they weren't, they hadn't been in Egypt for a very long time, the Persians, and so they weren't exactly experts on the terrain. No. But they did have the ability, obviously, to consult with locals. Or
have guides.
Right? And that's not mentioned, so it's like, I definitely think that they would have had the wherewithal to figure out their best route. And even if it was a very impromptu,
and even just thinking about strategics, this will come up again in another theory, but there's the idea that why would they take this route through the Oases when they were all controlled by Egyptians? They would have had to have fought their way through each one in order to get, because there was two oases. There was the Dakhla Oases and the Karga Oases. I don't even know if they went to the Dakhla one, to be honest. I think they went straight from Thebes to Karga. Yeah. So they skipped over that, but they would have had to have fought there. Which is another theory I'm discussing with that Professor Olaf Kapper. Right. And that is related to the second line of thought.
All right, well, let's get to the Castiglione brothers here, because these guys
get to the real entertainment here.
Yeah, this is the.
This is pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so starting, these guys, 1996 to 2009. Yep. Castigliones, two Italian brothers.
So give a little background on these guys. I mean, their first film.
They call themselves archaeologists.
Right.
Several of the newspaper reports that we saw on them basically refer to them as top archaeologists of their field, which is just kind of gets your radar up there. Hey, you're just like,
but basically, so they call themselves archaeologists, but they're filmmakers, or they were filmmakers, right? So their first movie was, I believe, in 1969, 68, 69.
They're all in the Mondo theme. So essentially what that is an exploitative documentary type or style of film.
Shock value.
It's a shock value film. It usually, the subjects are usually either foreign cultures or just taboo things, stigma related, whatever. So it could be, like, there was ones that were exclusively focused on death. That was kind of a resurgence in the 80s. Yeah. Which is just really creepy. It usually takes real footage too. It's not like, so things like suicides and murders and autopsies, that weird stuff.
Lovely stuff.
But before that, the idea of mondo was closely related to, exploitating foreign cultures. So these Castigliones, what was the name of the film? Did you mark that down? Or?
It's called Secret Africa.
Secret Africa.
Yeah.
So you get to see adult circumcision in that.
They did multiple films that would translate to the same title, Secret Africa, throughout the years. A series they would just keep going back and doing these shock value films. So obviously this takes away a little bit potentially from their credibility, but also they're just making movies, so it's what it is.
It's the 70s, man.
It's the 70s, yeah, 60s, 70s. So, but anyway, these guys, so later on, this is in the 90s, they're in Egypt.
They're in Egypt. They do follow the idea that the army did pursue the Oracle, and they did go west, but they kind of take a different route. So they had the idea that the army did not take this well-used caravan route that basically went from oasis to oasis, as most researchers tend to believe.
Okay.
They believe that instead they came from the south and tried to sort of take the oasis by surprise. So it says here, the Castigliones reckon that Cambyses' army must have taken a different route from Thebes into the desert than the one explored by earlier generations. Geological surveys they conducted over a new stretch of terrain further afield from the old caravan track revealed dried up wells and pieces of earthenware pottery from Persian water pots. So that's how you know. Anyways, and it says here, the army may have taken this alternative path through the desert in order to surprise the defenders of the Amon temple at Siwa Oasis, but were stopped short due to the unforgiving Saharan Kamsin wind. That was a quote from Time article dated November 17th, 2009.
Okay.
Yeah, so anyways, there's another article by Seeker dated in 2012. It discusses the finds, including pottery, human remains, a bronze dagger, and arrow tips found all around this large rock that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
So this rock, they hypothesized it could have been used as a shelter for the troops once this big sandstorm flew up.
Yep.
And this is further supported by these silver spheres that were thought to be from a necklace of Persian origins and an earring that was found a quarter mile away from the rock. So yeah, it was about 35 meters long, so that's about 114 feet long, and then 1.8 meters or 5.9 feet high.
Okay.
So that would shelter a grown man if he was
definitely
5'9". Weren't people shorter back then anyway?
Yeah.
Ancient people.
way to make me feel good, standing 5'9".
Unless you're talking about ancient giants, which we want to get into
ancient
as well.
Giants, 6'4", starting point guard in the NBA.
Oh man. So, anyways, they did date these finds to the Achaemenid Empire using visual assessment of an expert on ancient jewelry, and they also did thermoluminescence on the ceramics that they found.
Okay.
So those were dated to about 2,500 years ago, which is the right time frame.
That fits it. So that's an interesting theory. I mean, they definitely come at it from a different angle, for sure.
Yeah, this is interesting. Okay, this is another quote here from the same article. It says here, according to Castiglione, from El Kharga, so the El Kharga Oasis, the army took a westerly route to the Gilf El Kabir, passing through the Wadi Abd El Malik, and then headed north. So they went kind of like in a U shape, is kind of the description.
Well, that makes sense, because then they can go along the Nile a little bit, and then come up and loop around, and that gives them a little bit more of a an easier.
So with this route, they had the advantage of taking the enemy aback. And it says here, moreover, the army could march undisturbed. Because since the oasis on the other route were controlled by Egyptians, the army would have had to have fought at each oasis. So anyways, yeah, they did this. They found the water sources in the artificial wells and blah, 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 blah. Anyways, so there was, I don't know. So that's what their thinking was. And they did find all these artifacts and things, which they say they surrendered to the Egyptian authorities with no word back. Curious. Very curious. Right? Very curious. There was a press release from, I think that was dated from 2009, from the Supreme Council of Antiquities, basically discrediting all of their work and saying that they didn't have any permits and none of their finds can be taken as legitimate or real. So,
which is unfortunate.
It is very unfortunate for them.
Whether or not that's actually a real thing or not. Because it's like, it's kind of funny because it's like if someone who didn't have a permit stumbled upon a temple or a tomb, no one's going to say, that's not legit.
You have to leave everything as is, though, and then report it, and because you need the permits to dig.
No, for sure. But I'm saying, like, obviously with something that is a fixture in place, it's different than in, like, an arrowhead. If you move it, the context leaves.
Well, exactly.
Where if it's something else, you could actually, you know, but it also would be pretty hard to, I mean, so this was just, I mean, yeah, the first things they found there was, like, the arrowhead and the dagger, there was the
Bronze Age dagger, yeah.
Yeah, the Bronze Age dagger.
The jewelry. And then, okay, and this is another thing, too, because part of their team involved a couple of Egyptians. This guy, Dr. Ali Barakat, who is described as a geologist in some accounts. He's described as an anthropologist in other accounts. So, I don't know. According to his his, like, LinkedIn, he's a geologist.
His LinkedIn.
Yeah. And then there was the other guy, Walid Ramadan, who was the guide to the expedition. This is an interesting character, Ramadan. We're going to get back to him in relation to the documentary we watched.
Okay.
The 2002 documentary. But anyways, one other thing I want to mention before we move away from the Castigliones and their finds of these wells and these water pots, these Persian water pots.
Yeah.
I just want to make the connection just to say that these finds echo the radar findings of Chevet's in the 80s. Right? Very similar. Yeah. And they were they were literally 30 miles away from one another. So I'm not sure, like, obviously. And
they dated to the right time.
Exactly.
So that definitely adds to the idea that, yeah, that caravan route very well could have been used.
It is funny, too, because there's a Huffington Post article written by Gary S. Chevet's, dating to 2009, approximately 2 weeks after all these news releases were made about the Castiglione finds, which is kind of confusing in a sense, too, because they were conducting these apparently over the course of over a decade.
You're right.
And anyways, there's so much ambiguity and just contradiction surrounding when things were found and how they were dealt with, and then just, you know, putting together the chronological.
That is one of the most frustrating things with tackling a ancient mystery. It's a lot different than a modern mystery where you can...
And dealing with characters that aren't very scrupulous, because these archaeologists, huge air quotes there, they didn't even present their findings in an academic research paper. They made a movie and released it at a film festival.
And that is not academic.
No, and I kind of want to track that down. I want to see what that's all about.
Well, we did try to look for it a little bit. It was tough to find. I mean, it's going to be in Italian, presumably, and out there somewhere, but we'll have to get it translated to...
So they've been highly criticized. Chevet's remains uber critical of these two. Calls them shockumentarians, dating back to, their 1970s, whatever. Yeah. And, so he basically writes them off, as do other academics, because of their methodologies.
Okay.
Yes. So there's one other thing we need to cover, related to this line of thought. Okay. Which is the documentary.
Right. Yeah.
So this documentary was a 2002 documentary. It was titled The Lost Army of Cambyses. I will be including in the show notes a link to that.
We're going to be including all of our references in the show notes, so you guys can go and check out all of the things that we've looked through.
All the books that we've got from our library and, you know, online sources, that type of thing. Maps we want to include too, just so you have a better reference point as to the oases we're talking about and all this stuff.
Totally.
Yeah. Sorry, excuse that burp.
So, after Castiglione, we've got this 2002 documentary, and
that was inspired by their finds.
That was
of just the dagger and the two arrowheads.
Did they make? I can't remember. Did they make a specific reference to the Castigliones?
No,
they did not.
Not outright. Yeah. What they did, though, is in the very, very beginning, they talk about, how in the 80s there was like a resurgence of interest in it, and that there was this there were some findings supposedly that were highly contested. They don't say who found them. So I'm assuming they're talking about the Castigliones. Yeah. And the only guy that they refer to that was actually from that original expedition is this Walid Ramadan, the guide. So let's get into this.
All right.
We got some little bit of a hokey character in this. What's his name?
Tom Brown.
Tom Bone.
Oh, Bone rather.
There's no R.
Pardon me.
It's Brown without the R.
Tom Bone.
And his assistant or partner, or whatever you want to call her, Gail McKinnon, the resident skeptic.
Yeah, so we watched this documentary.
It's about a 48-minute documentary.
I mean, I'd say it's worth a watch.
Definitely. It's very inconclusive. It's very frustrating too, because you see moments where they make these finds, like say the where he finds this supposed fragment of a human skull, and it's just sitting in the sand right in front of him, and then he points to it, and then this Gail McKinnon, who's the archaeologist, which drives me crazy, she literally just goes over there and just picks it up. It's like, you don't do that. No, like you photograph it in situ. You have measurements. There's
multiple photographs and multiple. Yeah,
that drives me absolutely crazy.
But this is obviously for entertainment.
Well, that's just it, right? Like, yeah, is it just to sort of revive interest in it and get people going again?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, the funny thing about this documentary was, it's a lot of. They were going off of the Castiglione, the first find, but they didn't mention it. Mm-hmm. So they obviously didn't mention the fact that it's not very legit in the academic community. So they weren't going to start their documentary. This is before all these news releases, right? Because this is in 2002. All those news releases came in 2009. So it was more just, I think it was a little bit more under the radar, maybe? Because I haven't found any sources from the early 2000s. The only thing that I did find wasn't related to the Castigliones, and that was the year 2000, that expedition of geologists from Helwan University, and they were just looking for oil, and they stumbled upon bone fragments, arrowheads, that type of thing. Okay, yeah. That was not referenced in this documentary, but after they made those initial finds, they took it to Egyptian authorities, and that's when the Council of Antiquities, the Supreme Council, they said they were going to pursue it, and we just haven't heard anything since. Except for them discrediting the Castigliones. Yeah. That's the only thing we're going to post them. We're going to, like we said, but we're going to post the photos of some of these finds and stuff. And one of them from the Castigliones, the cache of bones, is really interesting to look at because they're sun bleached.
They look like they're from the dollar store.
They look like Halloween props a little bit. Now, it's possible that they could have become that white by being, exposed to the sun.
And it is possible that those photographs were taken after the bones were cleaned up as they lay on the ground, right? They could have been dusted off and whatever. So I feel like if you just uncovered that randomly, they would not look that pretty.
Definitely not. So there's some issues there. But yeah, this documentary with Tom Bone, they basically spend 45 minutes of it's a 45-minute documentary. They're wandering around kicking sand.
They end up finding a dead camel.
They find
that's the biggest find.
They don't really find anything, and it's sort of just,
they find shards of pottery dating from ancient times to modern times, and they don't. That thing for me that drives me crazy about this documentary is that they don't develop any of that. No. They don't go to any place that could say, like, date anything. They don't get the bones verified that they supposedly find. Nothing's verified.
No, it's pure entertainment.
And then it ends up, the last scene is just him staring at a big pile of sand saying, oh, we need to organize more stuff. We need to get out there and discover this lost army, because I know where it is, supposedly, but I don't know.
And then we were sitting there being like,
he's a bit of a buffoon.
Wow, super profound. Mm-hmm. But I mean, whatever. At least it is still being pushed forward, right? And I mean, that's important and that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this podcast in general, is to not only learn new things ourselves, but keep perpetuating the research for these things, because we want to, we're the Fox Mulders of the world. We're searching for the truth. We want to believe, and we want to find what actually happened, whether or not we're ever going to actually find what happened.
But we're intrigued.
Exactly.
We want to, and hopefully.
So the Tom Bone documentary didn't really. It just seems like his last name should be Brown. I don't know why it's Bone. Change your name, buddy.
Maybe it wasn't misspelling. I don't know. But I've seen it in several sources.
Nothing really came of that. No. There was no conclusive anything. The other accounts before that have been much more profound, and I think the most profound so far is the Castigliones. I mean,
whether or not that was fabricated remains to be seen. It's definitely been discredited by most academics and most people that are in the field.
So let's get to this last one, Capper.
Yeah. Okay.
Because this is the most fascinating, because it is the most current.
It goes against the grain.
It does. It really goes against the grain. So this guy, give a little background on this guy.
Even just before we get into that, what we're diving into now is the second line of thought related to the fate of the army.
Yeah.
So this has to do with the idea that they were not swallowed up by a sea of sand, and that they were in fact defeated by Egyptian forces. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sources and forces.
Sources and forces.
Forces of sources. Anyways.
Yeah. So this is Olaf Copper. Is his
Olaf
name,
Copper.
Right?
So this guy, I believe he's from Denmark.
I think
he's
so.
He's from a Nordic country.
He's Danish. He
Danish,
looks Danish.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, we watched a TED Talk of his, which was
interesting.
Illuminating.
Yeah, it was interesting. He's very well spoken, and he's done a lot of good work.
Definitely, he's an Egyptologist. Definitely, yeah. His main work revolves around excavating the Dakhla Oasis, and there's this temple in particular that he takes a lot of his evidence from. So anyways, yes, he theorizes...
and he specializes in this era of Egypt. It's not ancient Egypt.
Exactly.
It was in this sort of the last 400 years of the empire.
So he believes that the army was defeated by an Egyptian rebel leader known as Pedobastus IV. And the reason that he attributes it to this guy in particular is because of these stones that he's found that were basically... From what I've read, it basically was like the inscription above the entranceway to the temple. And this was common for all highly revered Egyptian leaders, right? They would build things, they would contribute, and they would have things named after them. And they would have, inscriptions about whatever. And so it was kind of ambiguous, though, as to whether or not this particular temple was built by Pedobastus IV, which would have been in the time frame of Cambyses. There was several Pedobastus, as you can see, but he's the fourth.
Yep.
Originally they thought it was the first, but then there were some inconsistencies with that, and they realized that it couldn't have been. It had to be this guy, Pedobastus the Fourth. So anyways, yeah, Capper reasons that the eventual myth about this deadly sandstorm was a cover-up by Darius, just to make up for Cambyses' failings as a ruler, and just to cover up the embarrassment, I guess.
So he thinks that was Darius covering that up.
Yeah.
Now, we'll get into our own theories in a minute here, and that's a point that I want to touch on, but you keep
sort of commentary on his theory.
Keep going with that.
Yeah, so anyways, this is a quote from Capper from a Sci-Fi News article. Sorry, Sci News, not Sci-Fi. Sci News. Anyways, quote, Darius I attributed the shameful defeat of his predecessor to natural elements. Thanks to this effective manipulation, 75 years after the events, all Herodotus could do was take note of the sandstorm story. So, yeah, he's going along with the idea that winners rewrite history, and Darius, in order to preserve the image of his predecessor, it's like, you know what, no, we're not going to let the Egyptians... Because basically what he was trying to do was wrangle up all these revolting kingdoms and parts of the empire that were sort of dissolving away after the event of Cambyses' death. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, there might be something to that. But anyways, yeah. So he goes on to, there's another quote here. Yeah. Anyways, I'm not going to read the whole quote because it's actually really long. But essentially, he believes that the final destination was Dakhla, which was where Pedobastus' army was located. And so he theorizes that... Okay, he kind of contradicts himself in a sense, because on one note, he's saying basically his army was sent to defeat Pedobastus and then move on to the Siwa Oasis is the idea. Right. But then he goes and says that they were ambushed and defeated that way. So it's like... I feel like that's kind of... It's
a bit of a contradiction.
A little bit, because if they were sent there with the intention of, how would they... Anyways.
He also has the very I immediately thought it sounded outlandish when he said it. But he does a TED Talk. I think, did we mention that? He has a TED Talk. We'll post a link to it. Because it's interesting. It's about 15 minutes.
The most hilarious claim, though.
Go for it, yeah.
This is right here.
Yeah.
So basically, he makes this offhand comment that it's nearly impossible to die in a sandstorm. Which
he says it is impossible.
Yeah, it's impossible. It's possible to die from thirst after being in the desert for days and days without water in a sandstorm. But he says you can't actually die from the sandstorm itself. Where we kind of looked into that a little bit further, and first-hand accounts from people that have been in a sandstorm essentially you are being suffocated by particles of sand.
If you do not have a bandana over your face, you will suffocate.
Yeah.
If you and
if you lay down, if you stay still, you're just going to cover up in sand. Yeah.
Yeah, you're buried.
Yeah, you're dead.
Yeah, there was accounts from Laszlo from Almaty in the 30s where he was doing his expeditions and he got trapped for 8 days in a sandstorm. He almost died. Yeah. Because he ran out of provisions. He was, holed up on the side of a hill or whatever it was, and
at least he almost died. Right?
And yeah,
imagine if you were in an army marching and all you have for protection is those around you.
Yeah.
So maybe they were huddling together and maybe, like for protection and then who knows? And they were already, no, I'm thinking of the army that went south where they were already weakened, right? From lack of food and supplies, that type of thing. But you never know what the conditions were with that particular army.
I think one of the main things that we touched on before that definitely kind of like adds to the legitimacy is the idea that Tom Bone mentioned this in that documentary, and it was mentioned in numerous other ones, that you got to take a zero or a couple of zeros off of the ancient account. So even if this 50,000 troop army was 5,000 troop army, that's stranger things have happened, crazier things have happened than I think a sandstorm becoming large enough to maybe not completely bury them instantly, but to
what if they got scattered? What if they were separated? That's a lot.
There's a lot of theories, and we're gonna get into our own in just a sec. But Copper, he has this. He doesn't think he can die in a sandstorm. He thinks that they were defeated potentially. He thinks that we should be looking for a battlefield in a totally different location.
Yeah, it's very, very vague. And for me, I know we don't know a lot of Pettibastus IV. Just speaking of just mainstream history wise, or even Egyptologists don't know much about this guy in particular, but what is curious to me is why this wouldn't have been recorded, right? Or maybe it was and it was just lost.
Yeah,
you don't
possibly.
know.
I mean,
maybe he did take credit, because this guy Pettibastus, he actually went on to rule Egypt for about 2 years in the wake of after Cambyses' death and this whole weird dissolution of the fringes of the Persian Empire, right. And then the reigning in of that. Yeah. And so he ruled for about 2 to 3 years.
And 2 to 3 years is a decent chunk of time.
It is. So you would think you'd have your accounts, you'd have your records, which is supported by the extensive construction at the Dakhla Oasis that he was supposedly in charge of.
Yeah, and Copper makes a point of that, saying obviously this guy was important. And if you're important, and the reason that you came to power was that you fended off the advancing Persians, you'd think that would be like the tip top of your accomplishments. Like, that is what you'd be telling that at party. Exactly. You'd be telling that at parties for years.
You have to wonder. After Darius took back control of Egypt, what if he just erased those records?
Possibly. That's another possibility, right? Because but here's another thing. So let's, I think now's the time. We're already kind of migrating. So
let's just go and critique all these people.
We're migrating into our own theories here and critiquing these. So, I mean, building on that, I think going back to the idea that Darius would have fabricated this story to cover up the shortcomings of his predecessor doesn't make sense to me. Yeah, he was Persian as well, but why would you...
It's not his reign.
It's not his reign. You're still in power. It's not like it's a democratic vote where you're going to be like, oh, this guy was also a Democrat. He screwed up, so now we don't like you anymore. Yeah. It's not like that. No. He could have... you'd think that he would flip that around and take a totally different approach to it and basically say, look how weak your former emperor was, and
you have to consider the relationship they had, though.
Did they have a good relationship?
Well, if anyone could have a good relationship with Cambyses, I would say it would be Darius, because he was one of his most trusted advisors. He was one of his spearmen, which I'm not sure. Right. I'm assuming that's just the king's guard, the people that were immediately surrounding him and advising him on the campaign and whatever. Well, but then you have to wonder, though, what if... I don't know. Darius could have manipulated things on several different layers, right? He could have...
I just feel like that Copper's... that speculation is even more speculative than some of these other things. To say that... Well, first of all, why does it soften the blow for his predecessor to say that the army was swallowed by the sand? Like, that's worse. That is worse than saying you got into a battle with a rebel king and lost. Mm-hmm. That's way more legit. That's way more legit than just being, I sent 50,000 troops and I shouldn't have, and then they got swallowed in the sand, they didn't even fight anybody, and now they're gone, and that was my bad.
Should have taken the coastal route.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a more softened blow to me. Mm-hmm. So that rationale doesn't really jive for me. Like, I don't really get that, and I also don't, like you said, obviously, Darius could have erased the accounts, but again, why would Petabastus not have touted this? Why would he not have touted this? And along the same line of thinking, going back to the original story, Herodotus' account, why would the Ammonians not have taken credit?
Yeah.
If they had a scout that had gone ahead, or they had knowledge that the army was swallowed by the sand, why would they not have just said that they defeated the army in some epic 300 stance?
Because that's where the account comes from. It comes from an Ammonian source. That's where Herodotus got it from. So
it seems very strange to me.
Why wouldn't you just take credit for it?
Exactly. I mean, you're Egyptian, you're fending off and advancing.
Unless they wanted to lessen the antagonistic elements with the Persians, be like, oh, you guys, there's a lot of crazy shit over here, and you probably shouldn't send people this way because of natural elements, not because we're powerful and we're going to defeat you, and we're challenging you by saying we already defeated one of your 50,000 strong armies. Yeah. Send another one, send 100,000. Like, might have just flared things up unnecessarily. Right. But you have to wonder whether they would have been thinking about that at all. Yeah. But
well,
anyways, so that's kind of the main gist
we've gotten basically to the end of this. So
still open-ended, nothing's been found,
but what do you think happened? If you had to pick we've reached the point here where we're at our conclusions. Definitely one of the most epic stories that I've come across.
Definitely.
There's so many angles to this, and I want to believe that this army is out there somewhere.
Me too.
For me,
but even it's kind of funny because in both circumstances, you're gonna find, a whole unless if the battle scenario actually took place, then perhaps the bodies would have been cleaned up. They would have been. I don't think they burned them, but I think they would have been buried. They would have been taken care of. They wouldn't have just been left in the desert, right?
No.
But, actually, no, they might have been, because remember Herodotus, he has several accounts of, remember he compares Egyptian skulls with Persian skulls, and he compares the thickness of them? Because he's at the site of a former battle that had occurred years and years previous. One of the battles probably in Cambyses' time, era, right? The consolidating Egypt into the Persian Empire. Yeah. And the idea that Herodotus, he basically states that the Egyptian skulls were 4 times thicker or whatever, or 3 or 4 times thicker than the Persian skulls, and he attributes that to the
sun, exposure to the sun.
Exactly, because the Egyptians would shave almost like a cul-de-sac, right? Yeah. And expose their skull, versus the Persians would always wear these felt hat things over their heads. Mm-hmm.
And they grew thicker hair, they would grow their hair or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, funny.
Which is hilarious, eh?
Yeah. Another reason to pick up the histories and give it a browse through, because there's lots of fascinating things in there.
Yeah, we've definitely had a lot of fun exploring this guy, this mystery in particular,
but ultimately, for me,
what about you? What's your conclusions here?
I think it's tough because the Castigliones, their account and the things that they found looked fishy, and they didn't take it from an academic stance. The methodology is not there. Yeah, it's not there. But I do like the theory that they took an alternate route, that they took a route south along the Nile and looped up the other way. They would have already been, maybe not those troops specifically familiar with heading that direction, but they would have had a lot more resources to work with heading that direction. Mm-hmm. And even if this was a super last minute brash decision to send these men, you still have generals. You still have generals and leaders and people. They're not just autonomous whatever. They're not just non-thinking whatever. Right? They had generals, and these generals took their orders, but they still would have made the individual decisions to like put them in the best position. And they were a super successful army. I mean, they had conquered the kingdom of Babylon. They'd conquered numerous, Lycia was another empire that Cyrus overtook. And I mean, these are the remnants of his empire. So it's not like it's a shoddy military.
No.
And I think I kind of buy that they might have gone that
how
route.
shoddy is your military? Does it have to do with the military itself or the leadership that's directing it? So.
But he wasn't physically there, is what I'm saying. I mean, you send an army off to do
there?
something, right? He did the Ethiopian.
Yeah, he was sitting in Memphis when all this was happening.
Exactly. So I mean, it's not like he's there saying no, we're doing it my way, you know.
Yeah, I hear you. You know, it's funny, actually. I did come across one account. It was an ebook. Oh, I think it's right here, actually. And they had it all wrong. They were saying, oh my gosh. What was the, oh shoot, I'm totally blanking now. But anyways, yeah, it was definitely an inaccurate account. And... anyways.
So what do you think though? What's I mean, ultimately at the end of the day, I think copper, I don't agree with the thing that you can't die in a sandstorm.
No.
You know, we've heard, I came across accounts where people, you know, would get, there would be, you know, powerful winds would blow up and it would strip the paint off the side of their Jeep in like half an hour.
Hours. Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't understand. If that can happen, but you can't die from a sandstorm, that doesn't add up to me.
Exactly.
So I'm not really buying that. You know, the other thing I wanted to make a point of, I think I did earlier, but Herodotus' account, like you said this, it's super brief.
It's just really vague. It's not like he hyped it up.
No, and he hypes up a lot of stuff in that book. And, you know, if he's getting this story secondhand from Egyptian low-level priests and different sources and stuff like that, if those sources liked Cambyses, why would they tout this? Mm-hmm. It's possible that Darius floated the story and that it was just a thing, but that takes away from the, you know, potential other accounts of Ammonians or other stories getting out. I mean, and floating out there, and maybe they're still out there to be discovered. You know what I mean? Like, we haven't found everything that's to be discovered in Egypt, and maybe there will be some more modern accounts of what related to this story.
I really want there to be another mission, another expedition that is focused on using LiDAR technology.
Yeah.
I think that's going to uncover the answers
I think so too.
We're missing. Because if this 50,000 strong army, or even 5,000 strong, with all the supplies, everything, there's definitely going to be evidence. There's going to be stuff to uncover. And sand is one of the best mediums to work with for LiDAR. So that, I feel, would be super illuminating.
So if you were to pick a theory that you thought was most accurate, what would that be? I mean, I'm riding with the Castigliones. At least the theory that they went south and looped up, and maybe they still did get swallowed in the sand. It just wasn't between the section of desert that was reported in the histories.
Because essentially, like, the way that it was described in that documentary was that it's almost like you start to go in a spiral through the sea of sand, and you just get lost and lost and more lost. So what part of the spiral they were on, right? Maybe they're just getting deeper and deeper and deeper into this like circle, right?
Yeah.
So who knows where exactly they ended up?
They could have just got disoriented. I think that's
who knows?
What happened.
Maybe the army ended up splitting apart, and it was just like fend for yourself.
I think that's what happened. Honestly, I think that's what happened. I think they took a different route than what is reported in Herodotus, because that was a outrageous route to take. Mm-hmm. And even if they did take that, this could still be possible. But I think if they went the southern way and looped up around, the idea that a massive storm still came about, and the idea that somebody saw them taking their midday meal when this happened makes more sense if they went the south way. There's more people, there's more villages and nomadic travelers in that region, rather than just heading straight out into the Sahara, right? So there was more chance of them being actually seen and this actually happening. Mm-hmm. And I think that possibly a storm, it was probably a lot smaller group than 50,000, mm-hmm. and that they got separated by a storm, and whether or not they were outright swallowed or not is irrelevant. They were probably, I believe that they got separated and died. in the desert.
Yeah.
That's my theory.
So you might not even find 50,000 bodies. You might find
found
scattered bodies.
Yeah, you might find.
And then once those bodies have decayed or like, you know, been mummified essentially, because it is super dry, hot conditions, which is perfect for mummification.
Yeah.
You would think that it's just scattered to the winds essentially.
All right, so I guess we're going to wrap this up. We're going to wrap up episode 1.
Hopefully you guys found this as entertaining as we did, and definitely look into some of the resources that we've looked into. We're going to be posting that, and we want to hear back. We want feedback.
Yeah, send us feedback. We know this first episode.
If we're too rambly, tell us. Yeah. If we are lacking details that you think need to be included, please let us know.
Definitely.
We're definitely open to all of that. And we just want to have a great time discussing this stuff and we want getting more people involved.
Absolutely. We want to get as many people involved as possible and put forward the best information we can. Mm-hmm. So any feedback, reach out to us on Facebook.
In the most entertaining way.
In the most entertaining way. Because all of this is just super fascinating. Mm-hmm. So you can reach out to us on Facebook. You can reach us at intotheportalmailbox@gmail.com. Mm-hmm. And
we have our website up now. It's intotheportal.com.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. As well, we do have, you already mentioned the Facebook, we do have a Instagram account that's going to be up and running in the next couple weeks, I would assume.
So lots of ways to reach out with us. Let us know what you think of this first episode.
Please.
And stay tuned for episode 2. That'll be released in the next few weeks. Mm-hmm. And that is going to be on the cryptid that lurks in Lake Okanagan, the Ogopogo. Mm-hmm. So thanks so much for listening to episode 1 on the Lost Army of Cambyses. We'll see you next time.
On Into the Portal.